The sun was a hammer blow against the baked earth. Alara lay sprawled, cheek pressed into the searing grit, the taste of dust and despair thick on her tongue. Her skin, cracked and blistered, clung to bone. Hours? Days? Time had dissolved into a single, endless ache under the relentless sky. They had ridden her out, deep into this desolate expanse. The men who had sworn protection, the one man who had sworn love, left her like carrion for the buzzards already circling, black specks against the blinding blue. Betrayal had a taste more bitter than the parched air. Her tongue was swollen, useless. Every breath seared her lungs, a shallow, desperate rasp. The wagon tracks they had followed were long erased by the wind, leaving only the indifferent, undulating waves of sand and rock. There was no water, no shade, only the infinite, punishing glare. She had crawled for a while, hands tearing on stones, but strength had abandoned her hours ago. Now, only the will to draw breath remained, a fragile thread that frayed with every passing moment. Her eyes, crusted with salt and sand, stared unseeing at the hazy horizon, shimmering with cruel mirages, lakes that vanished upon approach, trees that melted into distorted shapes. The world had narrowed to this small patch of burning ground, her body a vessel emptying itself into the void. Memories flickered, tormenting her. A cool stream, the scent of rain on grass, a gentle touch that now felt like a brand. How could kindness turn to such calculated cruelty? It was the mine, of course. The claim they thought she knew the location of, passed down from her grandfather. She had told them she didn't know, not precisely, that the maps were riddles only he understood. But they hadn't believed her. Greed was a different kind of thirst, and it had consumed them. They had taken everything, her small inheritance, her dignity, and finally, left her life for the desert to claim. A whimper escaped her lips, a sound swallowed by the immensity of the silence. Death felt close now, a heavy cloak settling over her. She no longer fought it, only wished for it to be swift. The buzzing flies were her only companions, landing on her lips, her eyelids. She lacked even the energy to swat them away. Surrender felt like the only path left. Let the sun take her, let the sand bury her bones. It was a cleaner end than the one they had intended, perhaps. A shadow fell over her face. Not a cloud. Something darker, more solid. She forced her heavy eyelids open, squinting against the glare reflecting off worn leather boots. They were scuffed, trail-worn, standing beside her head. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the haze of her exhaustion. Had they come back? To ensure the job was done? A different figure blocked the sun. Tall, lean, silhouetted against the blinding light. Not one of them. This was a stranger, clad in rough, faded canvas and leather, a wide-brimmed hat obscuring his face. He stood utterly still for a long moment, a silent, unreadable presence in the crushing heat. Alara could feel his gaze, though she could not see his eyes. It was an appraisal, detached and wary, like studying a downed animal. She held her breath, every muscle screaming in protest. What did he want? Was this a different kind of end? He didn't speak. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind's sigh and the distant call of a bird of prey. Then slowly he knelt. The action was unhurried, deliberate. He didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, a gloved hand, large and calloused, reached towards her face. Alara flinched instinctively, a weak, futile movement. He paused, respecting the boundary, but did not retreat. The hand hovered for another moment, then settled gently on her forehead, pushing back a matted strand of hair. His touch was surprisingly cool, rough but not unkind. Her eyes, fixed on the weathered lines of his face now visible under the hat brim, etched by sun and hard living, saw only a grim, stoic expression.
No pity, no malice.
Just assessment. He withdrew his hand, stood, and moved out of her line of sight. A moment later, she heard the soft jingle of tack, the shifting of a horse. He had a horse. The thought sparked a flicker of something other than despair, a desperate, fragile hope. But hope was a dangerous thing out here. It had been hope that led her to trust them in the first place. She closed her eyes again, focusing on the faint sounds he made. The scraping of a canteen being unstoppered. The splash of liquid. Was it for him? Or? The man Silas, though she would not know his name for a long while, knelt again. He held a dented metal canteen. His face remained impassive, eyes shadowed by the hat brim. He held the canteen out to her, not speaking. Alara stared at it, then at him. Was it real? Or another cruel trick of the heat? Her throat felt like parched earth, cracked and splitting with every attempt to swallow. Water. The word was a prayer, a desperate, aching need that eclipsed all fear. He nudged the canteen closer. Slowly, with trembling hands, she reached for it. Her fingers were clumsy, stiff. He didn't move to help her, just held it steady. She managed to grasp the cool metal, lifting it with agonizing effort. The lip touched her cracked lips. She tipped it back, desperate for a deluge, but only a trickle came. He was controlling the flow. It was agonizingly slow, but the cool liquid was a shock, a jolt to her system. It was water, real water. She swallowed, the pain in her throat intense, but the relief that followed was profound, immediate. She drank again, small sips, guided by his silent control of the canteen. He let her drink until her initial, desperate thirst was slightly quenched, then pulled the canteen back. Slow, he rasped, his voice low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was the first word he had spoken. Alara could only nod, too weak to voice thanks, her eyes still fixed on his face. He seemed to be studying her, looking for. What? A sign of recovery? A threat? He recapped the canteen, tucking it away. Then he moved to her feet. Alara tensed, but he merely knelt, examining her boots, her swollen ankles. His touch was firm, practical. He untied the laces, slipping off the stiff, sun-baked leather. Her feet were a mess, blistered and raw. He didn't flinch or comment. He simply shook his head slightly. Rising again, he walked back towards his horse. He rummaged in a saddlebag and returned with a piece of canvas and a small, dark object. He unfolded the canvas, creating a patch of shade larger than her own body offered. He placed the dark object, a compass, a piece of metal, on the ground to hold one corner down against the breeze. He then gently nudged her head and shoulders, indicating she should move into the shade. Alara, stiff and weak, struggled to shift. He offered no physical assistance beyond the nudge, seemingly assessing her ability to follow simple instruction. With immense effort, she managed to roll and crawl a few feet into the meager shade. It was a small reprieve, but it felt like salvation. The immediate, burning heat receded, allowing her body a moment's protest before the next onslaught. He watched her settle, then moved back to his horse. He loosened the cinch, pulled off the saddle, and hobbled the animal, letting it graze on the sparse, dry scrub nearby. He then returned to the shade, sitting down a few feet away from her, his back against a rock. He pulled out a piece of jerky and began to chew it slowly, deliberately. He didn't offer her any. It was not an act of cruelty, merely practicality. She wasn't ready for solid food. He sat in silence, watching the horizon, his rifle leaning against the rock beside him. Alara watched him from under lowered eyelids. He was lean, wiry, with movements that were economical and precise. Every action seemed calculated. His face was weathered, scarred faintly on one cheekbone. His eyes, she saw now, were a pale, piercing blue, constantly scanning his surroundings. He was clearly at home in this harsh landscape, wary and self-sufficient. An outlaw? Prospector? A loner? Whatever he was, he had not left her to die. That simple fact was a monumental thing. But saving her didn't mean he was kind or safe. He was an unknown quantity in a world that had just proven its capacity for ultimate cruelty. She closed her eyes again. The image of his pale eyes burned into her vision. She was still afraid, deeply afraid. But the searing pain of her thirst had lessened, and the direct assault of the sun had eased. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the possibility of not dying today flickered, fragile and uncertain, like a distant candle flame in the vast darkness. She did not know this man, what he wanted, or where he was going. But for now, his presence meant survival. And that, she realized, was the most important thing. He stayed there through the hottest part of the day, a silent guardian. Alara drifted in and out of consciousness, the brief sips of water and the sliver of shade her only anchors to reality. When she was awake, she watched him. He didn't sleep, not properly. He would rest, head back against the rock, hat pulled low, but his eyes were never fully closed, his body always coiled, ready. He seemed as much a part of the landscape as the rocks and the dust, weathered, enduring, and dangerous. As the sun began its slow descent towards the horizon, painting the sky in brutal oranges and reds, he stirred. He checked on his horse, then returned to her. He offered her another small drink from the canteen. This time, her swallows were less painful, though still difficult. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice still gravelly. Alara tried, pushing up with trembling arms. She found her body screaming in protest. Her muscles were wasted, her head swam. She swayed precariously, unable to bear weight on her feet. She sank back down, defeated. He watched her attempt without expression. "No," she whispered, the word thin and reedy. He nodded, as if confirming an expectation. He didn't seem impatient. He simply looked at the setting sun, then back at her. "Can't stay here," he stated, his gaze sweeping the vast, empty panorama. Staying in the open overnight was inviting trouble. Trouble, Alara understood, could come in many forms out here: animals, other people, the cold that would descend after the heat. He walked back to his horse and began to saddle it. Alara watched him, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. Was he leaving her? After all this? No, he wouldn't have given her water, given her shade, just to ride away. Or perhaps he would. She knew nothing about this man's code, if he had one. He finished with the horse and returned to her. He knelt down, not beside her head this time, but by her waist. He looked at her again, that same impassive, assessing gaze. Then, without a word, he reached out. He slid one arm under her shoulders, the other under her knees. Alara tensed, expecting roughness, but his movements were careful, surprisingly gentle. He lifted her. She was feather-light in his arms, her body a collection of fragile bones. The sudden movement made her dizzy, and she instinctively clutched at the front of his faded canvas shirt. He didn't react to her touch. He simply held her, his body solid and warm. He carried her towards his horse, the hobbles removed. The animal was a sturdy bay, calm and accustomed to its rider. He stopped beside it, the horse shifting slightly. Now what? He couldn't ride with her in his arms like this. He carefully adjusted his grip, positioning her more securely. Then, with a controlled heave, he lifted her higher, settling her across the horse's broad back, just behind the saddle. Alara was draped over the horse like a sack of grain, her face pressed into the animal's warm hide, her body aching. It was awkward and uncomfortable, but it was movement. It was leaving this place of death. He secured her somehow. She felt his hands adjusting straps, ensuring she wouldn't slide off. Then, he swung himself into the saddle in front of her. He was close now, his back a broad wall against her chest. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, the tension in his muscles. The horse shifted under his weight, then began to walk, a slow, steady pace. The motion was jarring against her bruised body, but it was forward motion. Away from the place she was left to die. Away from the men who had put her there. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the land. The air began to cool rapidly, the brutal heat giving way to a chill that seeped into her bones. Silas didn't stop. They rode through the twilight, the desert transforming into a place of shadows and whispers. She could feel his presence, a solid, dependable weight in front of her. He wasn't kind, not in the way she understood kindness. He was simply acting, driven by what she didn't know. Necessity, A flicker of conscience? Or something else entirely? It didn't matter. Not now. All that mattered was the steady gait of the horse, the warmth radiating from the man in front of her, and the fact that she was moving. Surviving. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the exhaustion and pain, but the immediate, crushing despair of being utterly alone had receded. She was not alone. For better or worse, she was with him. They rode for what felt like an eternity in the deepening gloom. The landscape became an indistinguishable blur of dark shapes against the slightly less dark sky. Silas rode with an innate sense of direction, navigating by stars that were now piercing through the twilight haze. He seemed to know this land intimately, every dip and rise, every potential hazard. He didn't speak, didn't check on her, simply rode with quiet purpose. Alara remained draped across the horse's back, her body growing increasingly stiff and sore. The initial fear of being so close to him, so vulnerable, had faded into numb exhaustion. She focused on the rhythm of the horse's hooves and the quiet strength of the man in front of her. She felt his subtle shifts in the saddle, the way he leaned into a slight incline, the almost imperceptible tension in his body when they passed a particularly dark cluster of rocks that might offer concealment. He was constantly aware, constantly vigilant. After what must have been hours, the horse's gait changed. It slowed, picked its way more carefully. Silas finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper in the night. Hold on. It was less a request, more a command. Alara wasn't sure what she could hold on to in her current position, but she instinctively tried to press herself closer to the horse's warm back. The horse began to descend. The ground became uneven, rocky. She could hear the scraping of hooves against stone. The air grew slightly cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth, a scent that felt impossibly rich and foreign after the dry heat of the day. They were entering a canyon or ravine. The darkness deepened, the stars now only visible as narrow strips overhead. The horse stopped. Silas dismounted with a practiced ease that belied the long ride. Alara felt the sudden absence of his weight, the shift in the horse's balance. Then his hands were on her again, carefully lifting her down. He didn't set her on her feet, knowing she couldn't stand. Instead, he cradled her for a moment, then gently lowered her to the ground. The earth felt cool and solid beneath her. She was stiff, aching in every joint, but undeniably better than she had been. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, looking around in the near-total darkness. They were in a narrow wash, surrounded by high, rocky walls. A small overhang offered protection from above. It was a hidden place, easily missed from the surface. Silas was already busy, unsaddling the horse, rubbing it down with a cloth from his saddlebag. He gave it water from a collapsible canvas bucket he produced. He moved efficiently without wasted motion. When he was done with the horse, he came back to her. He crouched down a few feet away. He pulled something else from his bag, a small metal box. He opened it, and the faint smell of tobacco reached her. He lit a cigarette, the match flaring briefly, illuminating his face in a warm, ephemeral glow, the sharp lines, the pale eyes, the weary set of his jaw. He inhaled deeply, the tip of the cigarette glowing red in the darkness. The silence returned, punctuated only by his quiet breathing and the soft sounds of the horse grazing nearby. Alara watched the glow of the cigarette, feeling a strange sense of detachment. She was alive. She was sheltered by a man who was a complete stranger, perhaps dangerous, but who had nonetheless pulled her back from the brink. She still didn't know his name or his reasons. But here, in the darkness, the fear was different. Less acute than the terror of abandonment, more a wary uncertainty. He finished his cigarette, pinching out the glowing tip carefully between his fingers before pocketing the butt. He rose. "Sleep," he said, his voice still rough, but the command softened by the exhaustion that seemed to cling to him. He didn't offer her anything to lie on, or a blanket. She was still wearing the thin dress she'd been left in. But the ground here was softer, less brutal than the open desert floor. She lay back down, pulling her knees up towards her chest, trying to conserve warmth. The air here was cooler, shielded by the canyon walls. Sleep felt like an impossible luxury, but her body was utterly spent. She closed her eyes, listening to his movements. He settled down a short distance away, not building a fire, presumably to remain hidden. She heard the soft click of a rifle being placed beside him. He was still vigilant, even in this secluded spot. She was safe from the elements, safe from immediate detection, but still acutely aware of the potential danger he represented. Yet, nestled in the cool earth of the hidden wash, the scent of damp rock and horse filling the air, sleep finally began to pull her under. Her last conscious thought was the image of his face in the brief flare of the match. A face that belonged to the harshness of this land. A face that had nonetheless appeared when all hope was gone. The days that followed were a blur of hardship and tentative recovery. They did not stay in the wash for long, moving on before the sun was high. Silas kept them hidden, traveling through less exposed terrain, always moving purposefully, though his destination remained a mystery to Alara. He was a man of few words, his communication limited to simple instructions. Water, when he offered her the canteen. Eat, when he grudgingly shared a piece of dried meat or a hard biscuit. Rest, when they stopped under the meager shade of an rock overhang or a sparse scrub tree. He never asked her name, never asked where she came from, never asked what had happened to her. It was a deliberate, almost aggressive lack of curiosity that suited Alara. She wasn't ready to speak, to recount the humiliation and pain. Silence felt safer. Slowly, painstakingly, her strength began to return. The water, though rationed severely, replenished her. The small portions of food sustained her. She learned to measure her sips, to chew the tough jerky until it could be swallowed. Her feet, initially too raw to touch the ground, began to heal, though they remained tender. Silas did not carry her the entire time. As soon as she could manage a few steps, he began to make her walk. Not far at first, just short distances during their stops, leaning against the horse for support. He watched her progress with that same impassive gaze, neither encouraging nor critical, just observing. If she stumbled or faltered, he would stop, wait, and then resume his pace when she was ready, or when he judged she had rested enough. There was no coddling, only a grim expectation that she would keep up as much as her body allowed. He was a demanding rescuer, perhaps, but his demands were rooted in the practicalities of survival in a merciless environment. She began to observe him in turn. She watched how he moved, how he read the land, how he conserved energy and resources. She saw the calloused hands that could handle a rifle with lethal efficiency or carefully dole out precious water. She saw the weary lines around his eyes, the constant tension in his shoulders even when at rest. He slept little, always taking the first watch, or seemingly staying awake the entire night, a silent sentinel. He ate sparingly, often giving her a slightly larger portion than he took for himself, an unspoken acknowledgement of her greater need, or perhaps her initial weakness. This wasn't altruism as she understood it. It felt more like a calculated investment in her survival, for reasons she still couldn't fathom. One evening, they were camped near a small, brackish spring. The water was barely potable even after Silas filtered it through a cloth, but it was water. He had managed to shoot a rabbit during the day, and he was skinning it expertly, the fire he had built small and carefully concealed. Alara sat a short distance away, watching him. The smell of raw meat and damp earth filled the air. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with unspoken things, with the shared awareness of their precarious existence and their strange, forced companionship. She cleared her throat, the sound louder than she intended in the quiet night. Silas paused in his task, his head snapping up, his pale eyes fixing on her. She hesitated, then spoke, her voice rusty from disuse. "Why?" The single word hung in the air. He didn't answer immediately, returning to his task. The crackling of the fire was the only sound. Alara waited, her heart pounding slightly. Had she overstepped? His knife continued its work, separating hide from muscle with practiced movements. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, almost thoughtful. "Didn't see the point," Alara frowned. "The point of what?" "Leaving you," he didn't elaborate. "Leaving her to die?" He hadn't seen the point of that. It was a chillingly pragmatic statement, devoid of sentiment. It wasn't pity or kindness or heroism. It was simply a lack of perceived utility in letting her perish. It was a stark, cold reason, but it was a reason. It offered no comfort, but it offered clarity. She looked at him, silhouetted against the firelight, the blood on his hands, the distant, haunted look in his eyes. He was not a savior in the romantic sense. He was something else entirely. And in this brutal world, perhaps that was enough. The rabbit cooked over the fire, filling the air with the smell of roasting meat. When it was done, he tore off a piece and handed it to her. It was tough and tasted faintly of the alkali water, but it was the most nourishing food she had eaten in days. She ate it slowly, watching him. He ate his share just as slowly, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The question of why lingered, but his answer, brief and brutal as it was, seemed final. He hadn't left her to die because he didn't see the point, because he could do something else, because, perhaps, in his own harsh calculus, her survival held more value than her death. It wasn't much, but it was the beginning of understanding. Understanding him and understanding the stark, unforgiving logic of this land. As the days bled into weeks, Elara grew stronger. Her body, though still lean, regained muscle and resilience. Her feet healed enough to walk for longer distances, though the tender scars remained. Silas taught her things, not with formal lessons, but through action and expectation. How to spot a distant dust cloud, how to find water or at least signs of its possibility. Where none seemed to exist, how to read the subtle shifts in the wind, how to move silently. He showed her how to clean his rifle, explaining the necessity of keeping it in perfect working order. He showed her how to make a secure knot, how to saddle a horse properly. He didn't teach her out of a desire to share knowledge, but because her ability to contribute, however minimally at first, increased their overall chances of survival. She became his shadow, moving when he moved, resting when he rested. The silence between them remained, but it was no longer filled with tense uncertainty. It was weighted with shared experience, with the rhythm of their journey. They were two solitary figures against the vast backdrop of the land, bound together by circumstance. She learned to anticipate his needs, handing him the canteen before he asked, spotting a loose rock before he stepped on it, automatically taking on small tasks without needing direction. He, in turn, seemed to soften almost imperceptibly around the edges. Not in his demeanor, which remained stoic and watchful, but in small, practical ways. He would share the last sips of water without being asked, adjust the canvas shade just so to protect her from the sun, choose campsites that offered slightly more comfort or better protection. One day, they stumbled upon a small, abandoned cabin nestled in a hidden valley, long disused and crumbling, but offering solid walls and a roof that mostly held against the elements. It was the closest thing to civilization they had seen in weeks. Silas checked it thoroughly, rifle in hand, before deeming it safe enough to stop. They spent 2 days there, a luxury of stillness Elara hadn't known since being abandoned. While Silas mended a torn saddlebag and checked their meager supplies, Elara found a rusty shovel and cleared out the worst of the debris and dust inside the cabin. She found a few usable items left behind: a chipped tin cup, a bent spoon, a length of rough cloth. As she worked, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. She was contributing, making their temporary space marginally better. That evening, Silas built a slightly larger fire in the cabin's broken hearth, the smoke escaping through a gap in the roof. As the flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, she finally spoke, the words coming hesitant at first, then flowing with a quiet intensity. She told him about the mine claim, about her grandfather's cryptic maps, about the men who had sought it, about the one she had trusted. She didn't dramatize it, just laid out the facts, flat and emotionless, as if recounting a story about someone else. Silas listened in silence, watching the fire. His face was unreadable. When she finished, the silence stretched again. She didn't expect pity or comfort. She had learned he wasn't that kind of man. But she felt the need to speak the truth, to name what had been done to her. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice low. They won't stop, Ilara nodded. She knew that. The lure of gold was strong, stronger than loyalty, stronger than life itself, as she had learned. Do you know where it is? He asked. Ilara shook her head. I told them I didn't, and it was the truth. My grandfather. He was careful, afraid of it falling into the wrong hands. The maps are symbols, riddles. He showed me things on the land, spoke in circles. I thought I understood, but she trailed off. The knowledge, if it existed, was fragmented, buried under layers of memory and cryptic clues. Silas was silent again. He didn't press her. He seemed to accept her answer. He stood up and walked to the doorway, staring out into the dark valley. We move on tomorrow, he said, not because of what she had told him, but because staying in one place was never an option for him. Ilara watched him, a flicker of something new rising within her. Not just resilience, but a quiet determination. She had survived. And now, she was moving forward, not just fleeing, but accompanying this man, this silent, capable outlaw. Their paths had converged in the most brutal circumstances, and now, they were walking them together into an uncertain future. Their journey took them towards higher ground, towards mountains that rose like jagged teeth on the horizon. Silas navigated canyon systems and rocky trails, avoiding the open country where they might be seen. As they traveled, Ilara's understanding of him deepened, pieced together from fragments and observations. She saw the wary way he avoided settlements, the quick, furtive glances he cast at any sign of human presence. He carried a worn wanted poster in his saddlebag. She had seen it once, catching a glimpse of a familiar face, his own, younger, harder, with a bounty attached. He was running from something or someone. His past was a shadow that followed him, just as the men who had abandoned her were her own looming threat. Their shared vulnerability, though different in origin, created an unspoken bond. One afternoon, traversing a narrow, rocky path, Silas's horse stumbled, dislodging a cascade of loose stones. The horse regained its footing quickly, but a large boulder shifted, trapping Silas's leg against the rock face. He cried out, a sharp, ragged sound that Ilara had never heard from him before. He fell to the ground, the horse shying away nervously. Ilara rushed to his side, her heart leaping into her throat. He was grimacing, his face pale under the trail dust, clutching his leg. My ankle, he ground out, his breath coming in short gasps. It's twisted. Ilara knelt beside him, assessing the situation. The boulder was too heavy for her to move alone. His horse was spooked but hadn't bolted, still close by. Can you reach your rifle? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He nodded, pain etched on his face. He managed to slide his rifle towards him. Keep watch, he instructed, his voice tight with pain. Ilara took the rifle, feeling the familiar weight of it. He had shown her how to load and fire it, insisted she know how even if she wasn't a marksman. She positioned herself where she could watch the path ahead and behind them, rifle at the ready. Silas, meanwhile, was working on his boot, trying to loosen it with shaking hands. The pain must have been immense. He finally managed to pull the boot and sock off, revealing a rapidly swelling ankle, already bruising badly. Ilara knelt beside him again. She wasn't a healer, but she knew a little about injuries. It needs to be wrapped, she said. He nodded. Saddlebag. Canvas strip. She retrieved a strip of canvas he used for various purposes from his saddlebag. I'll need you to hold it steady, she told him. It was the first time she had given him an instruction, and he didn't hesitate, grimacing as he held his leg still. Working as gently as she could, Ilara bound his ankle tightly, trying to provide support and prevent further swelling. Her hands were steady, her focus absolute. She wasn't thinking about the past or the future, only the immediate task, helping him. The silence between them was different this time, filled not with wariness, but with shared necessity and a fragile, nascent form of trust. When she finished, she tied off the canvas and looked at him. His eyes, pale and intense, met hers. There was a flicker of something in their depths, acknowledgement, Gratitude? It was gone before she could name it. Thanks, he murmured, the single word heavy with unspoken meaning. Alara simply nodded. She knew that word cost him something. His usual self-reliance was absolute. Accepting help was not easy for him. He tried to push himself up, but the pain made him gasp. He couldn't stand, couldn't ride. They were exposed on the narrow path, vulnerable. Alara looked around. Up the slope, she saw a small crevice in the rock face, large enough for one or perhaps two people to shelter in. Up there, she said, pointing. We can wait there until you can move. Silas followed her gaze. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than staying on the exposed trail. Help me, he said, holding out a hand. Alara took it, her smaller hand swallowed by his. With her supporting him on one side, his rifle in his other hand, they painstakingly made their way up the short, steep incline to the crevice. It was a tight fit, but it offered concealment. They settled in, Silas leaning back against the rock, his injured leg extended. Alara kept watch, the rifle across her lap. The sun was beginning to dip again. Being stuck here, injured and exposed, felt like a dangerous test. But as she sat there, side by side with this wounded, silent man who had saved her life, Alara felt a different kind of strength blooming within her, the strength of purpose, the quiet power of being needed. They spent the night in the crevice. Silas's ankle was badly swollen and painful. He didn't complain, but Alara saw the lines of pain etched around his eyes, the way he bit back gasps with every slight movement. Alara tended to him as best she could, re-wrapping his ankle, offering him water. She kept watch through the long hours of darkness, listening to the sounds of the night, the wind whistling through the rocks, the distant cry of an animal. The rifle felt heavy but reassuring in her hands. She felt responsible for their safety now, a responsibility that sharpened her senses and kept exhaustion at bay. With the dawn came the stark reality of their situation. Silas could barely put weight on his foot. They couldn't continue their journey, not like this. He needed time to heal, but staying here exposed and vulnerable was too risky, especially with his reduced mobility. There's a place, Silas said, breaking the long silence as the first light touched the canyon walls. His voice was raspy from pain and dryness. A few days' ride from here, hidden. Safer. Alara looked at him. Can you make it? He was silent for a moment, assessing the challenge, his own body. Have to, he said, his gaze hard. It's the only chance. Getting there would be arduous. Alara would have to ride while he led the horse, hopping on his good foot, or perhaps using the horse for support. They couldn't risk him riding with an injured ankle. It would take too long to heal. They would have to move slowly, painfully, and remain constantly vigilant. It was a daunting prospect. They spent the morning preparing for the slow, difficult trek. Alara helped him saddle the horse, a task made difficult by his injury. He taught her how to pack the horse correctly, how to distribute weight. She was no longer just a passenger. She was an active participant in their survival. When they were ready, Silas began the agonizing process of moving. He used his rifle as a makeshift crutch, hopping on his good foot, the horse walking slowly beside him, Alara mounted in the saddle. It was slow, painstaking progress. The pain on Silas's face was evident with every step, but he pushed through it, his determination a palpable force. Alara watched him, a mixture of awe and concern filling her. This was the core of him, this relentless endurance, this refusal to surrender. Her own hardship now felt intertwined with his. They were no longer just rescuer and rescued. They were companions in difficulty. They traveled like this for days. Alara learned to manage the horse, to read the subtle signs of its fatigue, to find the easiest path through rough terrain. She learned to ration their supplies with the same care Silas did. She learned to identify edible plants and track small game, though they had little luck with hunting. Their bond deepened in the shared struggle. Alara would dismount when they reached difficult stretches, helping Silas over obstacles, offering a steadying hand. He, in turn, would ensure she was cared for, making sure she had water and rest, watching out for her safety with a quiet fierceness. One evening, Huddled by a tiny fire that cast barely any light, the silence between them felt different. Less about guardedness, more about quiet companionship. Alara looked at him, his face softened by the firelight, the usual tension eased slightly by exhaustion. "My name is Alara," she said quietly. He looked up, his pale eyes meeting hers. He was silent for a moment, as if considering the weight of the exchange. Then he nodded slowly. Silas, the introduction, simple and belated, marked a shift. They were no longer just the man and the woman. They were Alara and Silas. Names given, acknowledged. A small step towards reclaiming their identities, lost and reforged in the crucible of the desert. The simple exchange felt like a significant moment, a quiet affirmation of the human connection that had somehow blossomed in the most inhuman of places. After what felt like an eternity, moving at Silas's painful pace, they finally reached the place he had spoken of. It was a small, secluded cabin nestled deep in a narrow, hidden canyon, almost invisible from the surrounding hills. Unlike the abandoned shack they had found earlier, this one looked maintained, if sparsely so. It was Silas's place, a bolt hole, a sanctuary from the world that hunted him. Getting Silas inside and settled was another slow, careful process. The cabin was simple, a single room with a stone fireplace, a crude table and chair, a narrow cot with a thin mattress. It smelled of dust, old wood, and something else Alara couldn't place, perhaps the faint scent of smoke and leather that clung to Silas himself. He sank onto the cot with a groan of pain. His ankle was still swollen, the bruising a deep purple. He needed rest, and real care, more than she could provide with just canvas strips and willpower. But here, at least, he was safe from immediate pursuit. They had some preserved food, dried beans, jerky, flour stored in metal containers to keep out pests. There was a small spring nearby, its water clear and cool. This was a place of relative abundance compared to the open desert. Alara took on the task of making the cabin habitable. She swept out the dust, built a fire, fetched water. She found a small iron pot and managed to make a thin stew from beans and precious jerky. Silas watched her from the cot, his eyes following her movements. The usual tension in his face was replaced by weariness and pain, making him seem almost vulnerable. He was reliant on her now, something that must have been deeply uncomfortable for a man as fiercely independent as he was. The dynamic between them shifted again. Alara was no longer the helpless survivor or the determined companion. She was the caretaker. She cleaned his injury, warmed water for him to wash, kept the fire going, cooked their meager meals. Silas, forced into stillness, could only watch and endure. The silence between them here was different again. It was the silence of two people sharing a confined space, the quiet punctuated by the crackling fire, the sounds of her work, his occasional pained sigh. One evening, as Alara was tidying the cabin, she came across a small, worn leather-bound book tucked under the cot. Curiosity warred with her respect for his privacy. She hesitated, then decided against looking at it. It was his, but its presence, a book in this harsh world, hinted at a different facet of the man, something beyond the survivalist and the outlaw. Later that night, as she tended the fire, Silas spoke, his voice softer than usual. "That book. It was my mother's." Alara looked at him, surprised by the unsolicited piece of personal history. "She taught me to read," he continued, his gaze distant. "Didn't want me to end up like some." He didn't finish the thought, but Alara understood. Like others trapped by ignorance, by circumstance, by the kind of desperation that led men to abandon a woman in the desert. His mother's hope, her desire for him to be more than his environment dictated, resonated with Alara. Her own grandfather had tried to give her a legacy, a chance at independence, though it had brought her to this pass. Silas's past was beginning to emerge, not through grand confessions, but through quiet, almost accidental revelations prompted by their enforced proximity. He told her small things about growing up poor, about the circumstances that had led him outside the law, about the loneliness of living on the run. His life had been one of constant vigilance, of trusting no one, of relying solely on himself. He had built walls around himself high and formidable. But here, in the quiet safety of his hidden refuge, with his body broken, those walls seemed to crumble, revealing the man beneath the hardened exterior. Alara listened, offering no judgment, only her quiet presence. She shared fragments of her own life, not the betrayal, which felt too raw still, but memories of her grandfather of simpler times. Their shared stories, incomplete and interspersed with long silences, wove a new, fragile tapestry between them, one not of shared hardship, but of shared humanity, of past wounds and present vulnerability. The fear Alara had initially felt towards him had long since dissipated, replaced by respect for his capabilities and a growing, gentle affection for the man he was revealing himself to be, complex, guarded, but with a core of quiet integrity. Weeks turned into a month in the hidden canyon. Silas's ankle healed slowly, the bone knitting back together, the swelling gradually subsiding. Alara continued to care for him, their routines settling into a comfortable rhythm. She explored the canyon, learning its secrets, finding wild herbs and roots, becoming as familiar with this small, secluded world as Silas was. She practiced with his rifle, becoming more proficient, her aim steadily improving. Silas, watching her, offered sparse, practical advice, how to hold her breath, how to sight, how to account for wind. He was a good teacher, patient in his own taciturn way. Their conversations grew longer, less hesitant. They talked about the land, the weather, the scarce wildlife. They avoided the deepest wounds of their pasts, circling them like cautious animals, but sharing enough to build a solid foundation of understanding and trust. Silas began to walk again, slowly at first, then with more confidence, testing the strength of his healed ankle. Alara watched his recovery with a sense of quiet satisfaction. Her care had made a difference. He was no longer dependent on her, the power dynamic shifting back towards a more equal footing. The balance between them had settled into a partnership. They were not lovers, not friends in the conventional sense. They were two people who had found each other at their lowest points and built something new from the wreckage. Alara felt a strength within her she hadn't known she possessed, forged in the crucible of the desert and tempered by her time with Silas. She was no longer the woman left to die. She was a survivor, capable and resilient. And Silas, the solitary outlaw, had allowed another person into his guarded world, not as a fleeting presence, but as a companion, a quiet anchor. His redemption wasn't a dramatic turn from evil to good. It was the subtle, profound act of choosing connection over solitude, of finding purpose in protecting and building a life with someone else. One afternoon, Silas, testing his ankle on the canyon floor, stopped and looked up at the sky. A hawk circled high above. "Getting on," he murmured, a statement about the season, about the passage of time. It also meant they couldn't stay hidden here forever. The world outside still existed with its dangers. Alara knew what he was thinking. The men who had abandoned her might still be looking, driven by greed for the mine her grandfather had spoken of. And Silas's own past was never far behind him. "What will we do?" she asked, the question hanging in the air. Silas turned to look at her. His pale eyes held a depth of feeling she rarely saw. "We could keep going," he said, his voice low. "Further on. Find a place." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Find a place together. Build something together. It was a proposal, unspoken but profoundly felt. For a man who had lived his life alone, it was a monumental offer. Before Alara could respond, a sound reached them, faint but distinct against the quiet of the canyon. The distant jingle of harness, the muffled thud of hooves on rock. Silas's head snapped up, his body tensing instantly, the weariness from his recovery replaced by the familiar coiled alertness. Someone was coming, into their hidden canyon. It could be anyone, but the sound wasn't the cautious approach of a lone prospector or traveler. It sounded like multiple horses moving with purpose. Alara felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Had they been found? Had the past finally caught up to them? Silas was already moving, hobbling quickly towards the cabin, grabbing his rifle. "Get inside," he ordered, his voice sharp, authority returning instantly. Quickly, Elara didn't hesitate. She ran into the cabin, grabbing her own smaller rifle, the one Silas had insisted she learn to use. Silas reached the cabin just behind her, kicking the door shut and barring it with a heavy wooden beam. He went to the single window, a narrow slit in the thick log wall, and peered out. His face was grim. Elara stood ready, rifle in hand, her heart pounding. The silence in the cabin was tense, broken only by their ragged breathing. The sounds outside grew louder, closer. Hooves on the rocky canyon floor, voices, rough and unfamiliar. They had been found. The sounds outside grew louder, closer. Boots scraped on stone, voices barked orders. The air outside the cabin was thick with tension. Elara stood near the fireplace, rifle held steady, her knuckles white. Silas was at the window slit, peering out, his face a mask of grim concentration. "How many?" Elara whispered. "4, maybe 5, he replied, his voice low and tight. "They're spreading out." Looking, the voices outside were rough, impatient. Elara strained to hear, trying to pick out words, identify them. Were they the men who had left her? Or someone looking for Silas? Or perhaps both? A sudden crash against the door made them both jump. Someone was testing its strength. The heavy log beam held, but the wood groaned in protest. "Come out, Silas. We know you're in there." A voice yelled from outside, rough and laced with malice. It wasn't one of the men from the desert. They were looking for Silas. But if they found Elara with him, her own past might come crashing down as well. "We just want what's yours, Outlaw. No one needs to get hurt," another voice shouted, clearly a lie. Silas remained silent, his gaze fixed on the outside. He wouldn't negotiate. He wouldn't surrender. His strength was in defiance, in fighting back. "Stay low," he ordered Elara, moving away from the window, limping slightly but moving with purpose. He checked the cabin, assessing their meager defenses. The walls were thick, but the door and window were weak points. He grabbed a shovel and began scooping dirt from the floor, piling it against the base of the door to reinforce it. Elara joined him, using her hands to scoop dirt, working frantically. The pounding on the door intensified, growing more violent. Wood splintered. They were running out of time. Silas finished with the door and moved back to the window slit, rifle raised. "They're trying to flank us," he muttered. Coming up the rocks, Elara moved to the opposite side of the cabin. Watching the door, her rifle pointed low. A gunshot cracked outside, the bullet thudding into the log wall near the window, sending splinters flying. Silas returned fire immediately, the roar of his rifle deafening in the small space. A cry of pain followed from outside. Elara flinched but held her ground. This was it. The confrontation they had been anticipating, perhaps since the moment Silas found her. Their bond, their fragile life together, was under attack. Another shot hit the door, lower this time. The wood was weakening. "They'll break through," Silas said, his voice steady despite the danger. "We need to get out the back." He indicated a small, rarely used exit at the rear of the cabin, obscured by brush. It would be a tight squeeze. He moved towards it, checking the bar that held it shut. "When I open it, you go first. Run for the rocks on the far side of the wash. I'll cover you." Elara nodded, her mouth dry. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but it was tempered by a fierce protectiveness of the life she had rebuilt, of the man who had given it back to her. Another gunshot, closer this time. A section of the door splintered inward. "Now!" Silas yelled. He heaved the heavy bar off the back door, shoving it open just enough for Elara to slip through. The air outside was cool and sharp. "Go!" he urged, giving her a push. Elara scrambled out, staying low, running bent over towards the dark shapes of the rocks. Behind her, she heard the door burst open, the shouts of men, and the immediate sharp crack of Silas's rifle as he laid down covering fire. Gunshots erupted, a chaotic symphony of violence. She didn't look back, focusing only on reaching the safety of the rocks. She reached the base of the canyon wall and scrambled up a short incline, finding a small overhang that offered concealment. From there, she could see the cabin entrance, now swarming with figures. She saw Silas, silhouette framed in the doorway, firing his rifle with deadly accuracy. His movements still favoring his mended ankle but lethal nonetheless. He was fighting for both of them. Her hand tightened on her own rifle. She might not be a marksman, but she could still contribute. She raised her rifle, aimed towards the figures near the cabin door, and fired. The shot went wide, kicking up dust near their feet, but it drew their attention. "Over there!" someone yelled. Gunfire turned towards her position. Bullets whizzed past, ricocheting off the rocks. She ducked down, pressing herself against the stone. But she had given Silas a precious few seconds of distraction. Alara ducked behind the rock, bullets whining around her. She reloaded her rifle with shaking hands, the metallic click loud in her ears. Across the wash, Silas was still holding the cabin doorway, his rifle spitting fire. The attackers, momentarily diverted by Alara's shot, were now hesitating, unsure of their numbers. "Two of them out here," someone yelled. Silas used the confusion. He ducked back inside the cabin, the firing pausing for a brief, tense moment. Alara heard movement from the back of the cabin again. He was coming out. She risked a quick peek over the rock. The attackers were regrouping, wary now that they knew the outlaw wasn't alone. Silas emerged from the back of the cabin, moving quickly despite his limp, using the terrain for cover, heading towards her position. He wasn't running straight across the open wash. He was using the broken ground, the shadows, the slight rises in the canyon floor. He was drawing their fire, giving her time. "Cover him," she muttered to herself, raising her rifle again. She aimed carefully this time, taking a steadying breath, remembering Silas's instructions. "Squeeze the trigger, don't yank." She fired. This shot was better, closer. She saw one of the attackers flinch and duck back. It wasn't a kill shot, but it was effective. She fired again, then again, laying down suppressive fire, her own small rifle a counterpoint to the heavier weapons of the attackers. She wasn't just hiding anymore. She was fighting. Fighting for her life, for Silas's, for the fragile future they might have. Silas reached her position, scrambling up the last few feet to her side. He dropped down beside her, breathing heavily, his pale eyes scanning the area back towards the cabin. "Thanks," he said, a genuine note of relief in his voice. "Didn't think you had that in you." "You gave me a reason," Alara replied, reloading her rifle again. It was the truth. He had given her back her life, given her a reason to fight for it. "We need to move," Silas said, already assessing their options. They'll push harder now they know the attackers, realizing they weren't dealing with a lone, trapped man, began to move more cautiously, but with renewed determination. They had Silas cornered, or so they thought. But they didn't know the canyon as well as he did. Silas knew a way out, a narrow, difficult path leading up the sheer rock face, known only to him. It was dangerous, especially with his ankle, but it was their best chance. "Can you climb?" he asked Alara, pointing upwards towards a barely visible crack in the rock. Alara looked up. The climb looked daunting, treacherous, but staying meant certain capture or death. "I can try," she said, setting her jaw. "I'll go first," Silas said. "Show you the handholds. If they follow, you keep climbing. Don't wait." It was a stark instruction, a recognition of the brutal reality. If he fell or was shot, she had to save herself. He began the ascent, his movements slow and deliberate, his injured ankle making every handhold, every foothold, an act of will. Alara watched him, ready to fire if anyone tried to follow. He reached a small ledge, then looked down at her. "Your turn," he called softly. Alara nodded, took a deep breath, and began to climb. The rock was rough against her hands, unforgiving. She focused only on Silas's instructions, following the path he had shown her, finding the holds he had used. Below, she could hear the sounds of the attackers nearing their position. She blocked it out, concentrating solely on the climb, on the feel of the rock, the strain in her muscles. She reached the ledge where Silas was waiting, pulling herself up beside him. They paused for a brief moment, catching their breath, listening. The sounds below were closer now, the attackers moving into the area they had just vacated. They hadn't seen the climb. Not yet. "Keep going," Silas whispered, already starting the next section. The climb grew steeper, more difficult. Alara followed him, pushing past the exhaustion, the fear. Her hands were scraped and raw, her muscles burning. But the will to survive, fueled by the image of Silas fighting for them below, spurred her on. They reached the rim of the canyon just as the first of the attackers appeared below, spotting their ascent. A shot rang out, echoing in the canyon. It missed. Silas and Alara scrambled over the edge. Collapsing, they had made it out bare. He had fought not just for his own survival, but for hers. He had given her a reason to fight back, a reason to live. The helpless woman left to die in the desert was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone capable of facing down danger and climbing sheer rock faces. And Silas, the solitary outlaw, had revealed a capacity for loyalty, for protection, for building something beyond himself. Their journey had been one of transformation, forged in hardship and tested by fire. They walked in silence for a long time, the only sounds their footsteps and the wind. The sun began to rise, painting the sky in soft hues, a stark contrast to the brutal light of the desert floor. As they crested a rise, a vast expanse of rolling hills stretched before them, leading towards a distant, hazy line of mountains. A new landscape, a new path. Silas stopped and looked out at the horizon. Alara stopped beside him. He turned to her, his gaze steady. There was no need for grand declarations. Their actions in the canyon, the shared danger, the mutual reliance, had said everything. "We'll find a way," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Together, it wasn't just about finding a new place to hide. It was about finding a new way to live. Not running and hiding forever, but building something stable, something real together. Alara looked out at the horizon, then back at Silas. The harsh lines of his face seemed softer in the morning light. The loneliness that had defined him for so long had been breached, not by choice, but by circumstance, by the unexpected arrival of a woman left for dead. And in saving her, he had perhaps saved himself, finding a path towards a life with purpose, a life shared. Her own despair had burned away in the desert heat, replaced by a quiet, unyielding strength. She had been broken, abandoned, but she was not defeated. She had found resilience, not in solitude, but in the unexpected connection with another wounded soul. The journey ahead would not be easy. Dangers still lurked. The shadows of their pasts followed them. But they would face them together. The outlaw and the woman left to die. They had found each other in the desolate expanse, and in doing so, had found a glimmer of hope, a chance for redemption, a future built on shared survival and a quiet, abiding trust. They began to walk, side by side, towards the horizon. The path was uncertain, the challenges unknown, but they walked with a quiet determination, two figures against the vast, indifferent land, bound together by the crucible they had survived. Their steps were steady, their purpose clear. To live, to build, to find a place in this harsh world. Together. The dawn broke fully, illuminating their path. It was a long road, but they were ready.